onto large government farms called communes. This program was very similar to the 5-year plans of collectivization that took place under Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. Both Mao and Stalin had a command or communist economy, which the government-owned businesses and farms made all economic decisions. Again, command equals communist. That's a good thing to remember there. For the upcoming tests, he also followed that up with the Cultural Revolution. This is a period in China where Mao used violent young communist soldiers known as Red Guards to eliminate all opposition that he had within China. It was a very kind of distressing time for a lot of older people, especially in China, because people who maybe were not as attached to communism as the younger people were just absolutely turned on by these young people, even sometimes kids against their own parents who were not sufficiently loyal enough to Mao, who was a dictator. We talked about totalitarianism that was definitely prevalent in China. So that Mao reign was followed up by Deng Xiaoping. He was the ruler in China after Mao. He changed the economy from China from a command or communist economy in which the government owns business to a market or free enterprise capitalist economy. Very big deal there, in which individuals own businesses. This is largely used, the system largely used in China today. And that was a big deal. So it's kind of a move away from communism, command communist economy. Although they still do somewhat say they're communist, they have a lot of foreign investment, especially from the U.S., which was really a big part of why China, is after the beginning of Deng Xiaoping's rule, took off in terms of economic growth. It became incredibly prosperous, growing really so fast it didn't even know how to handle itself. And it still kind of is in that state today, with huge cities popping up everywhere. China's, again, the most populous country in the world. And that kind of economic growth was really kind of attributable to the allowing of foreign investments, the allowing of a capitalist free enterprise economy in which individuals, again, own the businesses. The system is still largely used in China today. This was huge for China to grow it up, to kind of grow up out of this kind of agricultural society into a powerhouse of industry that it is today. But this did not come with a little bit of bloodshed, and the biggest instance of that bloodshed took place in Tiananmen Square in 1989. It was a series of protests in which Chinese peacefully demanded democratic reforms, and they wanted more rights and a say in government. Deng Xiaoping called in the army to repress these protests. Hundreds of Chinese protesters were killed or arrested. This proved the Chinese government was not willing to make democratic changes. So yeah, Russia, here's the thing that you don't want to get confused with on the test. So China, they had a real effort in Tiananmen Square to make these democratic changes that the Soviet Union was making. The Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, he was a lot more willing to make these changes than Deng Xiaoping and the Communist Party. They were not okay with it. And it really kind of represents the payoff that you got to have one or the other. You either got to have liberty or you got to have good economic times. Because for the Chinese, they've had good economic times, and that makes things a lot more, that makes it kind of the lack of civil liberties and lack of civil rights that were really present in China a lot less of a tougher pill to swallow. When you're able to put food on the table, you got a little extra money in your pocket, that is a big deal. Kind of similar to what we saw in Germany, really opposite of what we saw in Germany, where people weren't seeing good economic times, and they really were fed up with the government, because there's nothing quicker that will get a populace to turn on their rulers than lack of economic success. It's been a true thing. You see multiple examples throughout that in the course of history, especially some of the events that have been studied this year. Some of the current issues in China are the China controlling the Buddhist region of Tibet. This is where Tibet people want independence and self-government. China hasn't really given that to them yet. China denies its people human rights, such as freedom of speech and the right to vote, and only has one political party, again, the Communist Party. The leader there, Xi Jinping, recently extended term limits so he could pretty much rule for life. In order to prevent overpopulation, China now has 1.3 billion people, nearly more than an eighth of the world's population. The government of China, all in one country, the government of China only allows each family to have one child. So that is a pretty big blow for a lot a lot of people, it was like one-child policy they recently ended, by the way, but that was a controversial thing for a long time. And now what they're doing to the Uyghur Muslims, sorry if I'm saying that wrong, they are really kind of persecuting them too. They're putting up these re-education camps kind of to almost teach the Muslim their religious identity out of them, forcing it out of them. And that kind of influence is incredibly, it's raising a lot of eyebrows from human rights organizers and human rights watchers outside of China who are very concerned about what's going on there. So we're now going to turn our attention to the movement of decolonization. Decolonization is a period after World War II in which nations in Africa and Asia finally gained independence from the European nations that controlled them. I will start with India. In 1948, after World War II, India gained independence from Great Britain. This was largely due to the efforts of Mahatma Gandhi, which is where we talked about yesterday, through his Salt March, his peaceful protesting. Even though he was met with some pretty bad events like the Amritsar massacre, they were things that didn't really work out. So when the Amritsar massacre was in the middle of a peaceful protest, the British government of India fired on the crowd, killing many, many people. This really kind of set a lot of Indians off, but it also made things look really bad because this headline was published the world over, and it really shamed the government, which, I mean, again, may not sound like appropriate penance, but it was kind of a turning point in the movement for independence that Gandhi was pushing. In order to prevent conflict between Hindus and Muslims, the region was controlled by Great Britain was divided into two separate countries. India was the nation created for the Hindus of the region. Pakistan was the nation created for the Muslims of the region. Despite the creation of two separate nations, there is still ethnic tension between the Hindus and the Muslims in the region. So things didn't really work out. Kashmir is an area near India and Pakistan, kind of in between there, that both nations claim to control. The situation is very dangerous because India and Pakistan both have nuclear weapons. So this is kind of a thing that really could blow over at any moment, and something that really isn't a big point of contention right now, isn't really on the front of kind of international news, but it's always something that you have to worry about as one of the long-term issues around the globe. India, after independence, established a democratic government, and India followed a policy of non-alignment or neutrality during the Cold War, meaning it did not take sides or remain neutral, did not go to communism or not proudly say, I'm capitalist, also because it really wanted to take aid from the Soviet Union and the United States as well to kind of build it up into the kind of powerhouse it is. India really just recently overtook China as the fastest growing economy. Their incredible booming industry there, but still there is a lot of poverty. There is a lot of lack of wealth for all. It's going to be interesting to see how they adapt and see if they can spread it around to make sure that all of India kind of gets the wealth, not just the big urban centers. Like, they also struggle with that even today in China as well. The tale of two Chinas, the urban China and the rural China. So that is a struggle for India as well. It also has to deal with the caste system India did. Although India's constitutions are against discrimination against the lowest social classes in India, there still does continue to be discrimination in farming areas, such as tradition remains strong there. It was a really strong tradition there. History is a big deal. Discrimination against the untouchables is especially severe, so that is something they are still going to struggle with. In Africa, between 1945 and 1980, many of African nations gained independence. Independence largely achieved due to the efforts of nationalist leaders who led movements to gain self-government. So two leaders that fought for independence in Great Britain and from Great Britain include Jomo Kenyatta. He gained independence for Kenya from Britain through a very violent Mau Mau rebellion that was called. You need to know Kenya there is violent. And Kwame Nkrumah, he gained independence for Ghana from Britain non-violently. South Africa also got independence thanks to the efforts of Nelson Mandela and other leaders. After independence, white Europeans still controlled the government of South Africa. Sorry, my mistake. They got independence, but this apartheid system racial system known as apartheid. It was a system of racial segregation that was used in South Africa from 1948 until 1990. This is, again, after they had already received independence. There was just white people there who had colonized and breeded it and kind of just melted into society, and they were the rulers still. They were in charge. Black South Africans were required to use separate bathrooms, attend separate schools, carry identification passbooks, and even go to separate beaches. Nelson Mandela was the black nationalist leader who fought against apartheid. He was imprisoned for 27 years by the white South African government. He became the first black president of South Africa after apartheid officially came to an end in 1990. Because the thing was, there was a lot more black people than there were white people, but black people, again, they weren't really allowed to vote. They weren't really allowed to have a say in the government until apartheid ended, and in 1990, and Nelson Mandela quickly became a president. Rwanda, after independence in the 1990s, there's some serious ethnic conflict between the two groups in the African nation of Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis. The Hutus slaughtered 800,000 Tutsis in only a few months. This was an example of genocide that you really do need to know. Hutus slaughtering the Tutsis. In Southeast Asia, Cambodia and Vietnam were also decolonized. Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist leader, also a communist one as well, who led an 8-year war. He was, again, fighting against the U.S. in Vietnam. He was a national leader who led an 8-year war against France to gain independence for Vietnam. After independence, it was divided into two countries, Communist North Vietnam and South Vietnam. After the Vietnam War, again, it was reunited to form one communist nation. In Cambodia, after independence, it was ruled by a communist group as well called the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot was a leader of this group, and he was a ruler of Cambodia from 1976 to 79. He was a brutal dictator who denied people of human rights. He executed 2 million people within his nation, almost 20% of the population, which is also considered a genocide. All right, so that is the second last topic that we'll do today. But just before we move on, I just want to let you know that the leaders of decolonization that you really need to know are that really, again, national leaders. They're loyal to the people and devoted to their nation. These men include Mahatma Gandhi of India, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Nelson Mandela of South Africa, and Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam. The creation of Israel was a big deal in the Middle East after World War II, which is what we're going to be talking about. After World War II, part of the Holy Land, sacred area of Middle East that touches Jerusalem, was used to create the Jewish nation of Israel. Palestinians, the Arab Muslims that lived in the Holy Land, claimed that they should have control over the region since they lived there for hundreds of years and didn't really want to be kicked out of their homeland just because some other religion was like, yeah, we should have this. But between 1948 and 1973, 4 major wars were fought between Israel and the Arab nations of the Middle East, which Israel won all of them. Palestinians are still fighting to gain control of the Holy Land and frequently use terrorism to achieve their goals. They're really in a very tough situation, Israel and Palestine. Another factor in the Middle East that is rising, Islamic fundamentalism. It's belief that governments should create societies that are based firmly on the rules of Islam, Sharia law. Iran and Afghanistan have both established these type of governments. Iran did it during the Iranian Revolution. This event was what brought Ayatollah Khomeini, an Islamic religious leader, to power. Iran is a theocracy, which is a country controlled by religious leaders. The Shah, which was kind of the king there, he was deposed after being too friendly to the West, which it kind of was. But Ayatollah Khomeini was definitely very aggressive. He kind of brought things back for social rights. But he, the Ayatollah system, not the same guy, but Ayatollah, the same structure of government remains in power today. Also, the Taliban was an Islamic group that ruled Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001. It's created laws that are strictly based on Sharia. In countries that are based in Islamic fundamentalism, women have very few rights. They cannot dress, they cannot vote, and they're required to dress very conservatively, modestly in public. So that is not good. It's not anything we want to see for women's rights that are very much better in the United States. So that's what's going on in the Middle East, but really around the world. In 1991, communism began to fall at an unprecedented pace. And that really started in 1989 with the collapse of communism in Germany. Throughout the Cold War, Germany had been divided, as we said, into two nations. The Berlin Wall came down. This symbolized the end of the Cold War and really the end of